Hello. So I've been talking about the puja, and I've talked about three of the verses in brief. So there's obviously a lot more that could be said about the puja, but in 10 minutes or whatever, to talk about one of the verses, it's quite a short time. So just to recap, because today we're going to look at the confession section. And I think that can often bring up ideas about confession in Christianity. And so it's important to see what the difference is between the idea of Christian confession and confession in Buddhism. So we started out with worship, and we entered, you could say, a place of beauty. We recognized the beautiful in the spiritual life. In the second verse, we paid salutations. In other words, we bowed down to that ideal, to the ideal of enlightenment, to the ideal of fulfilling our human potential. So we recognised it, and then we started to respond, and we responded in a much deeper way when we went for refuge, going for refuge, the third section. And we're taking refuge in a way from our own negative mental states, from samsara, from the world that we create, from greed, hatred, and delusion. So we're going for refuge away from that and towards the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the ideal of enlightenment, the practical way that we can gain enlightenment, and the spiritual community that we're part of, because we all need help. We're not going to do it entirely on our own. So we recognise that, and we go for refuge, and we make that explicit by chanting the refuges and the precepts, that we take refuge not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. We say that we go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And having done all that, we start to recognise, oh, there's a bit of a gap. There's a bit of a gap between the ideal that I'm aspiring to and where I am now. So in practicing the precepts, so after the going for refuge section, we chant those refuges and precepts. And those precepts, once we start living them, once we start practicing them, we realise that actually perhaps we're not as ethical as we thought we were. So meditation, when we meditate, we start discovering aspects of ourselves that have been hidden. And certainly I can remember quite early on when I turned towards Buddhism, I had started off thinking I was quite ethical. I didn't really give it much thought. I just took it for granted, you know. I was reasonably kind. I was reasonably generous. I couldn't see anything that really was that bad. And yeah, when I started practicing Buddhism, I realised actually that there was a lot about me that I felt quite ashamed of, really, deep down, not on the surface. So I was quite, I would say, personality-wise, I was quite bullish. You know, I just kind of knocked my way through life, and if people didn't like it, that was their affair. So, yeah, I started to recognise actually, particularly that my speech could be really harsh, and I could upset people, and I just wouldn't worry about it. I would think it was, you know, their problem. So I realised that, I realised a lot about myself, about my own conditioning, about why I didn't care too much about whether other people liked what I said or didn't like. I became more sensitive, in other words, and that's what we need, is a kind of sensitivity to ourselves, to other people, and to the world. So we confess, and we confess all the things that we have done that have hurt ourselves and other people in this verse. So how is it different to Christian confession? Well, for one thing, we're not going to be absolved. No, there's nobody to absolve us. As it says in the Dhammapada, purity and impurity are personal concerns. No one can purify another, but we can purify ourselves. And we do that by genuine remorsefulness, by really seeing the harm that we create in the world and to other people and to ourselves. So just to give a couple of really obvious examples, perhaps we don't look after ourselves very well. Perhaps we get low moods, and when we get low moods, we eat too much, or we watch too many box sets. If we really care about ourselves, we look for, what can I do to help myself? Well, I could have more exercise. So exercise is known to lift moods. It's very good, you know, if you suffer from depression, if you have a regime of plenty of exercise, that certainly does help. And maybe we start having a more healthy diet. That's just showing care for ourselves. And with regard to other people, we can start caring more about other people. Maybe being more generous, maybe being kinder, maybe being more tolerant, more patient, less snappy, less blaming others. So we start seeing all these habits. So just to give one very obvious example, again, so yes, I started noticing quite a long time ago that, well, in what ways I was not very generous to Bodhivajra. So I was cooking a meal once, and these sausages were just slightly overcooked. Some were more overcooked than others. And my temptation was to roll a sausage over and put it on his plate that was a bit burnt. And realising what I was doing, you know, it was very subtle. Suddenly I thought, why are you doing that? Why not give him the best sausage? I know it sounds a very small thing, but these are the sort of things that if you can catch them in your mind, you know, if you can offer the last piece of cake to someone else rather than eating it yourself, you can sense in yourself this movement of from selfishness to a more open-handed way, a more generous way of being. And all these many things that we can do, they do act to purify ourselves. And it means that when we meditate, our conscience is much clearer. So it's only by changing our own behaviour. You know, nobody else can do it for us. However, it doesn't mean that we never verbalise or, confess aloud. I mean, sometimes I might confess to my shrine. I might confess, so you can see the picture over here of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and sometimes I'll confess to him. But also we might confess to friends. Now it needs a lot of trust. So often in spiritual communities we get together in small groups and we get to know each other very well. And we know all our wonderful qualities and we know our faults, and we help each other to see those. Maybe by gently pointing something out that maybe isn't very explicit, or if our friend confesses something, then maybe we applaud them for that, we encourage them, and all that is very helpful to us. So tomorrow I'm going to be talking about rejoicing in merits. So it's very important that these two go together. You know, we're not about berating ourselves all the time at all. We're about being more aware. That's the purpose of confession, to make something explicit so we can be more aware and move forward on our spiritual path. Let go. And that's an important aspect of confession, to really let go. We don't hang on to things. We don't think, well, because we did that, we're a bad person. No, we're confessing in order to really let go, to give something up, give up a behaviour that's not serving us very well. And that's a wonderful, liberating thing to do. So, yeah, I hope that makes a lot of sense. And I'll see you tomorrow.